She never planned to stay longer than 20 minutes. These events blurred together after a while. Soft lighting, practiced smiles, people speaking at her instead of to her. Taylor Swift knew the choreography by heart. Arrive, be gracious, be memorable in the ways expected of her. Leave before the weight of it all settled in her shoulders. He was never meant to be there. Taylor Kasly stood near the far wall, holding a glass he hadn't touched. He had replaced a colleague at the last minute, still carrying the faint discomfort of someone who hadn't prepared to perform. He wasn't scanning the room for connections. He was observing exits. They noticed each other not through eye contact, but through absence. In a room full of people trying to be seen, both of them were quiet. "You look like you're planning an escape," she said, stepping beside him, her voice low, almost private. "I already left," he replied without hesitation. "I'm just waiting for the rest of me to follow." She laughed, caught off guard by it. Not the polished laugh she gave interviews. Something softer, realer. She hadn't been to talk to anyone outside the script, yet here she was lingering. They didn't exchange accomplishments. No resumes. No numbers. They talked about people instead, how conversations changed when power entered them, how silence made some uncomfortable and calmed others. Kasly listened without the hunger she was used to. He didn't lean in when she spoke, didn't interrupt, didn't perform interest. That unsettled her. They met again days later. Then again, always quietly, always deliberately. Late nights that bled into early mornings, in spaces where she could remove her name like a coat. With him, she didn't have to translate herself into something consumable. He never asked her to write a song. She never asked him where it was going. That unspoken balance became fragile and intoxicating. One night, sitting on the kitchen floor because the couch felt like too much distance, she said something she had never said out loud. "I don't know who I am when no one's watching anymore." She expected reassurance, a compliment, a defense of her strength. Instead, he said, "Then maybe this is where you remember." Her eyes filled before she could stop them, not because he saved her, but because he didn't try to. The outside world began pressing in slowly. Questions from her team, invitations that assumed his presence would be temporary. Taylor felt the familiar tension return, the quiet panic of being seen too much. Kasly noticed it in her posture, in the way she only exhaled once the door was locked. They didn't argue about love. They argued about exposure. He didn't want to be hidden. She didn't know how not to protect what she loved by locking it away. Neither of them said it, but they both sensed a fracture approaching, the moment when something real will be forced to justify itself to a world that only understood spectacle. For now, they stayed, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. And neither of them yet understood how expensive honesty could become. The first headline didn't appear all at once. It arrived in fragments. A question from a friend that lingered too long. A look from a stranger that lasted half a second longer than comfort allowed. A name mentioned casually, like bait dropped into water. Taylor Swift noticed before anyone else did. She always did. Fame trained you to feel shifts in air pressure before storms. She didn't tell Kasly at first. She tried to carry alone, the way she carried everything else. Quietly, efficiently, with a smile that never reached her spine. Kasly noticed anyway. "You're editing yourself again," he said one night, not accusing, just observing. She froze. "I'm tired." "I know," he replied, "but that's not what this is." Silence stretched between them. The good kind. The kind that had once felt like shelter. Now it felt like a test. She sat down across from him, knees pulled to her chest. "If they find you," she said carefully, "they won't just look. They'll dig. They'll decide who you are before you get a chance to explain yourself." "I'm not afraid of being seen," he answered. "I am," she said. And then, softer, "Not for me, for you." That was the moment something shifted. Not broken yet. Just misaligned. The rumor finally landed on a Tuesday. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was written confidently enough to feel true, vague enough to be unprovable. A source close. A quiet figure. A private relationship. Nothing illegal. Nothing cruel. Just enough to invite speculation. Her phone didn't stop buzzing. Kasly read it once, then closed his laptop. He waited for her to call. She didn't. By the time they met again, hours later, the room already felt smaller. Taylor stood near the window, arms crossed, her body angled away without realizing it. He recognized the posture. Defensive, strategic. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked. The question landed harder than she intended. He looked at her, not hurt yet, just surprised. "No." She nodded too quickly. "Okay, I just needed to ask." "You didn't," he said quietly. "You needed to protect yourself." Her jaw tightened. "You think this is easy for me?" "No," he replied. "I think it's automatic." That was the first real fight. No yelling, no dramatics. Just two people realizing they were standing on opposite sides of the same fear. "I can't lose control of the narrative," she said. "You don't understand what that costs." "And you don't understand what it costs to be erased," he said. "To exist only when it's convenient." She turned toward him then, eyes sharp. "I never erased you." "You hid me," he said gently. "There's a difference." The silence that followed wasn't the good kind. Days passed, then weeks. Meetings replaced moments. Messages became shorter, safer. She started speaking like someone who was already preparing a statement, even in private. He stopped asking questions he didn't want answers to. They didn't break up dramatically. They drifted, slow enough that it felt mutual, clean enough that no one could blame the other. The last night they spent together, it rained. Of course it did. It always rained when things ended quietly. They sat on the same kitchen floor, where everything had once felt possible. "I never wanted to be a secret," he said. "I never wanted to make you one," she replied. Both statements were true. That didn't save them. He stood first, grabbed his jacket, paused at the door like he was waiting for something she didn't know how to give. "Take care of yourself," she said. He looked back at her, eyes steady. "I hope one day you don't have to disappear to survive." Then he was gone. Taylor Swift didn't cry right away. She cleaned the apartment. She organized her notes. She answered emails. She turned loss into motion the way she always had. But later, on a stage, alone during rehearsal, she sang a verse that had nowhere to go. Her voice broke on a line about being loved without being owned. She stopped singing, sat down, and for the first time, she didn't try to turn the pain into something useful. Across the city, Kasly deleted photos he never planned to show anyone, not because they hurt, but because they were complete. He understood something then. Some people change your life not by staying, but by showing you what honesty feels like once. They never spoke again. Months later, an album was released. Fans dissected lyrics, mapped names onto metaphors, argued online with the confidence of people who thought proximity meant truth. Kasly listened once. He recognized himself not in the words, but in the restraint, in what she left unsaid. At an award show years later, Taylor paused before thanking anyone else. "Some people teach you how to listen," she said. Nothing more. Somewhere far from the cameras, Kasly smiled. Not because he was remembered, but because he was understood, and that he knew was enough. She thought time would soften it. That was a lie everyone believed about endings. That distance diluted meaning. That repetition dulled memory. That new noise replaced old silence. Taylor Swift had written enough songs to know that wasn't true. Time didn't erase anything. It just changed the lighting. She kept moving. Tours, meetings, cities that blurred together until hotel rooms felt interchangeable. Her calendar stayed full by design. Still, there were moments, unguarded, unscheduled, when memories slipped through. The way someone listened without trying to fix her. The relief of not being interpreted. The rare safety of not being managed. She never said his name out loud. Not because it hurt too much, but because saying it would make it real again. Kasly rebuilt his life in quieter ways. He moved apartments, took on projects that required presence instead of ambition. People around him noticed a change, but couldn't name it. He was calmer, sharper, less willing to compromise things that mattered. Loving her hadn't made him bitter. It had clarified him. Sometimes he wondered what she told herself about him. Was he a chapter? A lesson? A risk she'd outgrown? He decided it didn't matter. The truth had lived between them, not in the retelling. When her album dominated everything, charts, conversations, headlines, he avoided at first, not out of pain, but respect. Eventually, curiosity won. He listened alone, late, with no distractions. The songs didn't try to immortalize him. They didn't even describe him. They described space. The distance between who you are and who you're expected to be. The exhaustion of being visible. The comfort of someone who doesn't ask you to perform. He understood then. She hadn't written about him. She'd written from the place he helped her reach. That was more intimate than credit. For Taylor, success felt different after him. Still exhilarating, but heavier. She trusted fewer people with unfinished thoughts. She guarded her private self more carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it was real. In interviews, she spoke about boundaries, about choosing herself. The words were true. They were just incomplete. One evening, years later, she sat alone with a piano, fingers hovering over keys. A melody surfaced, familiar, unresolved. She smiled faintly and let it fade instead of capturing it. Not every truth needed to be archived. Some were allowed to exist only once. Kasly heard that same melody weeks later, played softly in a cafe by a musician who didn't know its origin. He recognized it instantly. Not the notes, the feeling, the almost, the restraint. He stayed until the song ended, then left without explaining why his chest felt lighter. They never crossed paths again. But sometimes at the edge of large moments, before a show, before sleep, before choosing differently than they once would have, both of them felt the echo of a connection that had never asked for permanence. It had only asked for honesty. And even now, long after the silence settled, that honesty remained. Not loud, not visible, but intact, still there. Years later, the world slowed just enough for reflection to slip in. Taylor Swift sat alone in a quiet house. She rarely stayed in long enough to call home. The awards were boxed, the headlines archived. The noise still existed, but it no longer reached her the same way. She had learned how to turn it down, not completely, just enough to hear herself think. She opened an old notebook, not lyrics, observations, fragments of thoughts she never shaped into songs because they were too precise, too personal to survive interpretation. One line caught her attention. Some people love you by leaving you unchanged. She closed the notebook. For the first time, she understood that what she and Kasly had shared was never meant to last in years. It was meant to last in impact. He had seen her without asking for ownership. She had loved him without knowing how to protect him from herself. That wasn't failure. That was timing. Across the city, in a life no one would ever analyze, Taylor Kasly stood at a window, watching rain fall against glass. He had built something stable. Quiet, honest. He was known where it mattered, and anonymous where it didn't. Sometimes when people asked about the past, he smiled and said nothing. He had learned that some stories don't want an audience. They never reunited. No dramatic crossing of paths. No final conversation that tied everything into a perfect sentence. Life rarely offered that kind of symmetry. Instead, it gave them something more durable. Peace. On a night before a major performance, Taylor stood backstage, listening to the crowd roar her name. She felt gratitude, pride, control, and beneath it all, a calm she hadn't known before she learned how to be seen by just one person. She stepped onto the stage. Somewhere else, Kasly turned off a lamp and sat in the dark, content in the knowledge that he had once loved someone fully, without needing proof. The world kept speculating. It always would. But the truth was simple. They didn't end because love disappeared. They ended because love alone wasn't enough to bridge two lives moving at different speeds. And that was okay, because what remained was not regret but clarity, not longing but respect, not silence but understanding. Some connections are not meant to be kept. They are meant to be carried. And both of them did, quietly, completely, and without needing to look back. The end.